think that someone should change the rule that men have to wear suits in weather like this. But anyhow, thank you.
It's so cold, you know, you need to have a blanket.
That's true. So thank you all for being here. It's a great turnout. So we have a very limited amount of time with a fantastic guest. So I'm going to make just some very, very brief introductory remarks, get to my questions, and then I'd love to turn it over to you. So first of all, the host organization, PS21, Project for the Study of the 21st Century. The banner right behind. Please visit the website. It's projects21.org, and it's a relatively new organization. It was started last January 2015, formally incorporated, and it's an organization that really, it's kind of a virtual think tank, so to speak. It's bringing together people from across the world, fellows and experts from across the world on different topics, different countries, different regions, and really one of the goals is to democratize the discourse and bring more people into the conversation about international affairs. So it's a fantastic organization, really, really honored to be affiliated with it, and would encourage you all to check it out. And then, so that's that, and I want to introduce our fantastic guest. We're really in for a treat. Dr. Fiona Hill is the director of the Center of the United States in Europe and a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. From 2006 to 2009, she was a national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council, and she's a co-author of a book that actually the second edition just came out called Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. And I would say that when I think of, I mean, if I were making a list of top 5 people, top 3 people on Russia, Eurasia, Central Asia, U.S.-Russia relations, you name it, that gamut of issues, Dr. Hill would be at the top of the list. He really is a treasure for the policymaking community and also for the analytic community. So I think it's really a treat to have her here. So thank you very much for being here. I'm going to dive right in. I think I'll probably stop around 3:45, and then I know you have to head out around 4:15, you said, so we'll have maybe a half an hour or so for questions from all of you. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Okay. So my first question, I was reading a number of your articles on the way over here, and you have such a prodigious amount of output that I didn't actually really know where to begin. So I started with one of the articles at the top. So this was an article that you wrote for the Brookings Institution blog, and this was on, I don't know if Brexit had actually occurred at this time, but I think either Brexit had just occurred or it was about to occur. But I wanted to quote from you a couple of lines from that blog post that I found really, really compelling and thought-provoking and provocative, and maybe I just ask you to reflect on them a little bit more. So Dr. Hill says in this blog post, or said in this blog post on June 24th of this year, quote, separating the United Kingdom from Europe institutionally, politically, and economically could be as wrenching as pulling apart the USSR. And then later on, and I believe that this is the concluding 2 sentences, quote, England could find itself the rump successor state to the United Kingdom. If so, I like that one. I had the rump successor state, that was good. If so, another great imperial state will have consigned itself to the dust heap of history by tying its future to a referendum. And interesting, when I read that last,
embedded quote from Trotsky there. Just
when I read that last sentence, actually it reminded me. So just a couple of weeks ago, the Economist from time to time, they had this feature where they invite readers to submit words or phrases that they think should be incorporated into the lexicon of international affairs and finance. And one of the readers had submitted an entry called plebiscite, which is basically destroying democracy, or basically undermining your own power by a plebiscite. So I thought that was it. But so just those 2 statements, and there were many other really interesting and thought-provoking statements in that blog. But if you could just reflect a little bit more on those 2 statements, what you think the ramifications are, not only for the United Kingdom, for London as a kind of a financial hub, but also for Europe, and just delve a little bit more into those statements.
Well, I have to confess, Ali, that one of the seeds that germinated the idea for this piece was actually another PS21 event in London at the end of April. And I encourage all of you who want to kind of, go out there and see the world, keep being involved with PS21, because I was over at the end of April and early May in London and Dublin for some other meetings. And Ali's colleagues and friends from PS21, Peter Apps from Reuters, who I'm sure most of you all know, said, well, could you come along and do a sort of similar event in the Winston Churchill rooms, near the Foreign Office? I mean, as any, kind of native-born Brit, just the idea of the Winston Churchill rooms in the Foreign Office was, yeah, I'll be right there. This was the balcony from which Churchill, kind of addressed everyone in front of the War Memorial on Whitehall. I mean, I don't think he slept in these rooms. I mean, who knows? He's never been to Churchill, but he'd certainly been there, and many a bon mot was thought up. And on my way there, I was walking from another meeting, and I passed the statue on the end of Pall Mall to go down the steps to Crimea. And I was actually walking around with my friend from Kazakhstan, whose pen actually I not actually properly or inappropriately have right now. And she looked at this and she said, Krim Nash. I mean, she's a Kazakh, actually, by the way, Crimea's ours, kind of Russian. I said, no, Crimea's ours, British, it's Florence Nightingale, the birth of the National Health Service, the modern epidemiology, first, woman who gets a statue, kind of in Britain, and, we got the balaclava and all kinds of other, sort of strange things, which actually terrorists seem to have appropriated now, to keep everybody warm. We had the charge of the Light Brigade, one of the most disastrous, kind of cavalry operations in British history. And, Brits are very good at great defeats and putting up statues to that as well. And of course, that was a huge clash between, the Russian Empire and the British Empire, and led to all kinds of things that many of you here, are very well aware of. And I was sort of thinking, there's so many similarities between Britain and the British Empire and the Russian Empire. And then the whole atmosphere in London at the time was all about Brexit. It was about what was going to happen. And if you went outside of London, which I did, and I was in Dublin and also in the north where my family are from, it was pretty obvious that there was a great crisis was brewing. And it made me think back to when I first started studying Russian, which was in the mid-1980s. But I was also a student in the Soviet Union at the end of the 80s. And I was working at the Kennedy School during the whole period, the Kennedy School at Harvard, in the early 1990s, when everything was falling apart. And it made me, I was reflecting back on the referendum in 1991, when Gorbachev was trying to keep together the Soviet Union. I thought having a referendum on a new union treaty to kind of get people to rally around this would be a very good idea. Now, this referendum passed, but an awful lot of people, or republics and elites, didn't want to take part in it. And this was shortly followed by the August coup, which is a coup in Turkey, very similar. Erdogan goes off on vacation to Marmaris, and kind of a coup breaks out. Gorbachev went off to vacation in Crimea. And
so don't go on vacation.
Some places we probably shouldn't go to. And this, started off the whole process of unraveling. We've had Boris Yeltsin jumping on the tank. We've had Boris Johnson jumping on the kind of proverbial tank, or kind of all kinds of weird things that Boris Johnson has done. Boris is with big hair, in another context. And really, the Soviet Union was picked apart by elites in the work of a referendum, and that's exactly what it felt like in London at the end of April and early May. A month or so, a couple of months out before Brexit, that it was like being in the Soviet Union when the wheels started to come off. When elites were very unhappy about the overall enterprise, when there was a kind of a big discussion about how you would restructure this. And there's some shocking similarities between the United Kingdom, not the European Union and the Soviet Union, but the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. They're both remnants of empires that have reconstituted themselves and have been having a major identity crisis. As we're sort of thinking about, many of the issues that we're dealing with Russia today are the big imperial hangover. And, in Britain, it came, fairly immediately on after World War II. Britain was in immediate decline after World War II. A lot of the problems that we're dealing with today in the Brexit are really the unresolved complications of losing an empire, of losing an identity, and also of being in economic decline. I see a couple of colleagues here who know a thing about the economy in Russia and the Soviet Union. And, never really kind of finding a place in the world, but also not being really able to revitalize the old industrial base. And that was really what the Soviet Union was like in that period as well. Although it was still an imperial state, reconstituted from the Russian Empire as the Soviet Empire, Russia was really the rump that sort of sounds rude actually from keeping this together. It eventually became, the rump state, but it was the anchor, but it wasn't really the defining factor of this. And England isn't the defining factor of Britain. And you're in this storied environment of London with all these, kind of great statues to previous imperial escapades. But you've got a Britain that has, become disassociated from its capital city. In the case of London, 40% of the citizens of London today are non-native Britain. In other words, being born somewhere else. But if you look at about 60% of the population, is probably first or second generation from the outside. And London and Moscow are very much are very similar. Moscow was the great melting point part of the Soviet Union. Russia is very much dominated still today by Moscow. Moscow has the largest Muslim population of any European city, not just of any Russian city. Moscow has a very diverse population. It's the center of all economic, political, financial activity. It has the Moscow city aspirations the same way as the city of London. It's very much an international city with a foreign policy in many respects all of its own, a global megacity. London, very similar. So there were so many parallels that were occurring to me at the time, and I thought that it was actually probably, some people might think it's a bit of an overstretch, but probably worth warning about some of the consequences that Britain might face in, kind of an ill-chosen referendum what turned out better than the Union Treaty referendum that Gorbachev tried, but it would have the same kind of monumental consequences, but it revealed the fractures, it revealed the weak firmaments of the state as it was so constituted.
Yeah, I thought it was a brilliant piece, and I think that it's a really illuminating parallel. I wanted to ask you, to what extent is there buyer's remorse? So we read, there were a lot of articles in the aftermath of Brexit, and there was one, and I think maybe it was exaggerated a little bit, but it was saying that many of the people who had voted in favor of Brexit were then Googling, what is the European Union? Are we a part of the European Union? But I think they said that at any one time, the maximum number of people doing that Google search was maybe 1,000. So maybe
so it wasn't
too many people with buyer's remorse. But there are some people now who seem to, what I found actually interesting was that many of the very ardent proponents of Brexit, policymakers in Britain who are very ardent proponents of Brexit, don't actually seem to be too keen now that Brexit has come to pass, and now people are saying, okay, you have to shoulder the responsibility. And so, to what extent in England is there buyer's remorse? Is this a happy outcome? Are people disenchanted? But what's kind of the prevailing mood right now? And just based on also all of your travels, what's the mood right now?
Well, probably Boris Johnson and Liam Fox are in town today, so maybe you might have seen them tearing around town.
We should have them in.
Yeah, exactly. I tried to do that for Brookings, but we couldn't find them. I think they're here for a meeting on ISIS and dealing with Syria with Kerry and the refugee crisis. But it's very clear that they didn't have a plan in place. And so I think the biggest problem that Britain is facing is that this is going to play out in all kinds of unpredictable ways for the foreseeable future. And this is exactly the parallel again with the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin, when he hunkered down in the Belarusian woods in a hut with the head of Ukraine and Belarus, they didn't really have a plan either. They were very dissatisfied with Gorbachev and the way that the Soviet Union was careering, in their view, out of control. They wanted to have a more devolved power to the republics, with Russia wanting to have more of a say. Doesn't it sound familiar with England and Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales? They wanted to have more of a say in their own affairs, but they didn't really, in many respects, they wanted to completely dismantle the Soviet Union. Remember, there was an effort to create the Commonwealth of Independent States that Yeltsin really hoped would not be the basis for a divorce, but would be the basis for a renewed relationship among the key states. But of course, the Baltic states didn't want to be part of that, and Georgia and other republics were not keen on the idea either. And this is exactly the kind of state that we have in the United Kingdom. There are elites who are very dissatisfied with actually the governments of Britain, or they had their own personal political aspirations. Obviously trying to outmaneuver Cameron. There was an awful lot of the Night of the Long Knives involved in the Brexit campaign. The EU was kind of like the substitute for the sort of the overbearing, overarching superstructure that they wanted to get rid of. This take our country back was more about kind of a sort of a devolution of authority, kind of back to home. But you've got different layers of that too. Obviously Scotland, their vote to stay in the EU was still very much a vote for a Scottish autonomy within the United Kingdom. One of the reasons that the referendum on Scottish independence didn't go through in September was people really wanted to be part of something larger, the EU, not just left together with England. And that's exactly what happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union. You had then further layers of unraveling, of centrifugal forces within Nagorno-Karabakh in the case of Azerbaijan, Transnistria and Moldova, Abkhazia and South Ossetia in the case of Georgia, who wanted to be part of a larger entity but didn't want to be part of a smaller entity where they were left just with the other titular state. So, within the United Kingdom, you've got all of this complexity, and it clearly wasn't thought through about what the implications would be for governance at home, let alone the future relationship between the UK and the EU if the referendum was passed. Now, there's still an awful lot of politicking around that. It still has to have a parliamentary review. The Scottish National Party has become a major force in central British politics, have seats in the Westminster Parliament. There's speculations whether they might try to block this. The Labour Party, the second political party in the UK, is in complete disarray because the parliamentary party, so the members of Parliament, are completely out of sync with their grassroots base, and so the party has become split over the issue of Brexit. And then obviously in the Conservative Party, there are also people like Theresa May, the new Prime Minister, who, at least nominally, were in favour of remaining within the EU. So they've got to lash all of that together. And when you think back 25 years to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was all very similar. Many people wanted, the Central Asian states at the time didn't actually want to be independent. There was a great shock in Almaty and Tashkent and elsewhere about what had happened. They were kind of left feeling that they'd somehow been orphaned, overnight. We talked to many Kazakh officials back at the time that they were completely shocked that this had happened. They hadn't really been consulted. There's the Belarusian and Ukrainian and Russian leaders, off in a hut somewhere, kind of making decisions about all of their futures. And that's the similar kind of process they're getting in the UK now, where, some people, find this a great new opportunity, and others are, really feeling, the whole firmament of, their positions, their businesses, their households being taken away from them. So I really think that this is going to play out in ways for years to come, in the same way that we've been dealing with the consequence of the collapse of the Soviet Union.
So let's widen the aperture a little bit. We've been focusing on Brexit in the UK, but I'm curious for Europe as a whole. I'm curious right now we're seeing a lot of obituaries being written for the European project. So you have the ascendance of populist parties left and right, geographically and politically. You have Russian revanchism. You have Russia, which a lot of people argue is kind of, there's a certain schadenfreude that now that with Brexit that perhaps that Russia can exploit European weakness. And so you have, and also of course dealing with the stresses coming from migration and immigrants. And so you have this I think that kind of in the heyday of there was kind of a post-Cold War utopia that we're going to have a peace dividend in Europe. We won't have to worry about instability, at least not to the same extent that we did during the Cold War. But now you have this very, I think, unexpected confluence of stresses on the European project. So do you think that right now the European Union is undergoing essentially a rough phase, but one that it'll emerge stronger, more resilient, or do you think that those obituaries that are being written for the European project are onto something?
I think they're actually onto something, but let's kind of be fairly clear that there were always multiple European projects. And I think that's kind of part of the issue that we're dealing with here. It just wasn't so apparent. In many respects, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was also unexpected. There were some of us around the table who remember this quite vividly. Some of you around the table might not remember it quite so well, but anyway, the kind of period from August to December 1991. That was the kind of the Bush 1 administration. You might remember, that George Herbert Walker Bush was a bit shocked by all of this. We're all kind of going now and, repassing, who told what to whom, about NATO expansion and all kinds of other issues. But, there was the famous Chicken Kiev speech that, George Bush made, really trying to say, look, this is not in our interest to have the Soviet Union fall apart. And the collapse of the Soviet Union, in many respects, was kind of like an accelerant to a lot of developments in Europe. There's the famous, book by Francis Fukuyama, the kind of the idea, the last man and the end of history. But this kind of showed this sort of triumph of the sort of transatlantic, Euro-Atlantic world and the architecture. But I think that's decidedly questionable. They were still also works in progress in this period. We had immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union and getting into the early into the early 1990s, we of course were immediately confronted by the similar forces and the collapse of Yugoslavia, the wars in the Balkans. There was so much happening in a very fast time, and European, Euro-Atlantic institutions had to adapt to that. And it's really kind of that they were the only institutional arrangements that were there. You know, the Russians are now in the revisionism that you're referring to. They're saying that, you know, when agreements were signed between Moscow and the West, you know, it's going to be the 30th anniversary of Reykjavik coming up, you know, this fall, and the big arms control agreements. You know, there was a sequence of events that were underway in the late 80s and into the early 90s that were focused on arms control and working out a new relationship between the Soviet Union and NATO and the United States and you know, the kind of European states. There was an agreement in you know, 1990, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Charter of Paris, and on, you know, kind of arrangements that would move this forward. Everyone was thinking in a very different context, and the Soviet Union fell apart. And then we were all sort of scrambling, trying to find our
the objectives of Russian foreign policy are. And so, you look, 5 years ago, so this is a famous speech that Putin gives. This is October 2011. And he gives a speech, I think it was an address to the Russian parliament. I could be mistaken, but I think it was to the Russian parliament. And he called for the establishment of the Eurasian Union that, in his words, would serve as, quote, an efficient bridge between Europe and the dynamic Asian-Pacific region. And he said that he wanted this Eurasian Union to occupy, quote, a prominent place in the international system. And so, as Michael McFaul and many others have said, 5 or 6 years ago, Russia seemed to be, if not dramatically ascended, it certainly seemed to be in a much better strategic position and economic position than it is today. It was initiating trade agreements, it was involved in various diplomatic efforts, and so the idea of a resurgent economic Russia, and this was also before with a lot of the developments about oil, which have affected the Russian economy so dramatically. So at least it seemed plausible that the Russian economy could serve as this kind of dynamic bridge between the European, or Western Europe, and the Asia Pacific. Now, though, you don't really hear that kind of rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin, and at least my own impression, I'm curious what you would think of this. My own impression is it seems that Russia, now that it is more isolated from Europe, it's more of a supplicant to China and more dependent on China than it was before, facing a lot of internal challenges. It seems to me that to the extent that there is a Russian strategy or Russian foreign policy, it seems to be more about how Russia can profit from disorder than order, and how it can profit more from fomenting chaos, whether in Ukraine or Syria, than about actually promoting a constructive vision for Russia's place in Europe. Is that wildly off the mark, or would you say that there is a more constructive Russian grand strategy that Putin has in his mind?
Well, it's not necessarily off the mark. It's that, kind of for Russia, there's sort of a couple of historical dilemmas, which no matter what incarnation you think of Russia in, as the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and the modern Russian Federation, as Russia is always with this vast geographic spread pulled in multiple directions. It's not just east and west, it's north and south as well. And I think one thing that we always have to bear in mind is that Russia is a multi-regional power. And what I mean by that is, it's by just pure geography. Russia extends not just in a European context, but sort of central and extending down to South Asia, Afghanistan, and linkages to the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean by the Black Sea, obviously the Barents and the Arctic, and then the Asia Pacific and the Russian Far East. But it's also a multi-regional power by inclination and desire as well, and that's kind of a pattern that you see, certainly throughout Russian history through the periods of expansion. The problem is that just the vastness of this landmass and the relatively small solid population always make Russia vulnerable, and vulnerable to the outside. So there's always this inherent sense of insecurity, and it's especially more prevalent towards Europe because that's where the largest concentration of population is. But always, through the periods of expansion in the 19th century and onwards, to some degree also to the Far East. So Russia always, in many respects, has to stand up in some way to the west, and then to a lesser degree to the east. To basically protect itself in some way. So there's always a security dilemma for Russia. And then there's also the fact that, Russia just has this vast, porous set of borders. And, this isn't trite, this isn't just, something that, Russian, kind of political thinkers make up, to kind of justify, Russia's foreign policy. It's a matter of fact that Russia always has, in many respects, these indefensible borders, but it always has these interconnections through migration. There's been migration across this territory for a long period of time, which continues. So Russia always has these linkages to Kazakhstan and into Europe and elsewhere. And it always wants to dominate as a result. Its neighbourhood. This is always a neighbourhood of immediate weaker neighbours. And just like many of the other larger civilizational powers, that's what Russia calls itself, and it's actually accurate. With a long history, just like China does, and other countries do, a distinct language and kind of a long set of interactions with neighbours. Russia naturally wants to kind of feel a sense of being in control of its neighbourhoods. But how Britain expanded within the British Isles. Ireland was the first colony. You have to remember of the British Empire. It wasn't then kind of the movement to India or elsewhere. It was Ireland. And Russia has always had these tensions between how to dominate the region, in what form, either by force of arms and expansion and imperial conquest, or later by complicated arrangements with the Communist Party and different federal structures of the Soviet Union, and now with the Russian Federation, which is still a microcosm of the Russian Empire. So you've always got this kind of tension between a kind of a domestic policy and how to constantly modernize to mitigate your vulnerability and to be able to stand up to the other outside powers that are also rising and competing, and then how to also be the dominant power trying to do at the same time. He's playing the anti-establishment figure when he's very clearly an elite figure. Although he's somebody who's sort of transcended that to try to appear to be a working class hero, and Putin spends a lot of time doing that. That's a lot of the political stunts that Putin does. And he's been quite adept at it, drawing upon his own kind of personal history, hard scrabble background, coming from the back streets of St. Petersburg, which might seem a bit bizarre here, but it's like saying the back streets of any city, pulling itself up by the bootstraps. Personal history, which really, in the Brexit context, people are saying, look, we're not being listened to. We don't have a say. These elites are not representing us. There's no authentic voice that's ours in this. And be it Brussels or Westminster or the Conservative Party or the hierarchy of our own party, the Labour Party, or whatever the voter was expressing, it was definitely an anti-establishment vote of dissatisfaction. On many cases, some was much more sophisticated, by the way, and an awful lot of people voted for very different reasons about perceptions of the EU stifling trade, or resentment about European workers who didn't need to have work permits or have a certain salary to have the right to remain. I had a lot of friends from Canada, Australia and others who were relatives who were angry that they had to basically have a work permit, they had to apply, they had to get a certain job with a certain salary to kind of come to Britain. But if you were, Pole or French, German, you could kind of come in and get a job without a work permit. So again, complicated sets of issues in that.
Yeah. Well, one of the troubling aspects of the confusion and uncertainty in Europe is the impact that it seems to be having on the new members of the European Union, where a lot of very unfortunate, unwelcome things are happening, in particular in Poland. And I wonder where you see that going, and how much is it related to other factors?
Yeah, I mean, this is. Do you have anything specifically in mind on this?
I guess what's mainly in my mind is Poland.
Yes, yeah, because that's what I was wondering. I mean, you spent time, obviously in Poland. So I was, that's why I wanted to ask the question, because I was in Poland at the end of May, beginning of June, and so it's pre-Brexit, but we were supposed to be there talking about Russia and in advance of the NATO summit, but everybody wanted to talk about Brexit because. As you quite well know, there's been quite a shift in politics inside of Poland with the Justice Party coming in. And there is a very strong antipathy within the party to Germany. And up until the recent Polish elections, there had been a long trajectory, as you're all aware, of Polish-German reconciliation. There's been a lot of effort had been put into. And it almost seems that this has been torn up and thrown out the window. So when I was in Poland, I was very struck by the anti-German sentiment that I hadn't noticed previously. You probably didn't really see how long ago when you were in Poland?
About 3 years.
3 years ago, yes. You probably might not have noticed, but maybe it was always there somewhat beneath behind the scenes. And how Poland was shaping its relationships within the EU based on a closer relationship with Britain and with Hungary, which was a little weird. And less kind of pulling back from really, in spite of all the polls in Brussels and in the EU and Commission level and elsewhere, and Tusk, of course, playing such an important role there. The current Polish government really trying to, pull back from closer. So sort of in a way also going back to let's take our country back, national sovereignty, more assertiveness of a sort of a Polish perspective, but we still want to be within the EU. But, maybe we want to latch ourselves onto Britain, which is, looking to kind of reform, if it hadn't been Brexit, this kind of, Cameron deal on Britain, which might kind of create a different tier of Europe, another European project that we can be, more part of. The playing with Hungary seemed a little bit more, they didn't really want to be going towards being Viktor Orban, but it was kind of, but Hungary is another one of those, sort of pulling apart a different Europe. Obviously, great antipathy still towards Russia, so not going to go down the Viktor Orban and Hungary route. And also a very close relationship with the United States. So I'm very curious now as to how Poland is going to play this policy moving forward. Because the only, so Kaczynski, the only ambassadors he was seeing were the Hungarian, the British, and the American. And, kind of course him being the, the power behind the throne, I mean, the man on the throne, but in a different place from being in the parliament, in the president's office. I think there's an incredible question there about, how Poland rethinks itself. Hungary is obviously another, question entirely, and has been, trying to sort of play off. This gets into the kind of question at the beginning. There's lots of opportunities for, Russia to exploit to kind of further weaken the European Union. If, the perspective is that if you need to formulate another, another set of structures for yourself, it's perhaps, kind of better if everything else is weakened. It gives you more room for maneuver, kind of more scope for invention and, your own initiative. All of, Russia's policy previously had to be predicated on dealing with NATO and dealing with the EU and then dealing with the rise of China. I mean, now we've got kind of a big kind of free-for-all. It seems that China is still a constant here, but NATO looks very much weakened, the EU for sure. Now you've got all of these other players, trying to kind of jostle and, kind of scope out their policy. But Poland is very, very much in opposition to, more of a Russian role. So I think this really complicates the picture. As you can see here, I'm just throwing out an awful lot more complications because I'm trying to get my own head around this now. How is all of European security going to play out? Getting back to the question about Ukraine. I mean, how do we manage this moving forward? What happens to the Minsk kind of agreement that was being taking place in this format with France and Germany? Aren't sort of on part of the EU. Does the UK play any role in this? The UK gave, Ukraine along with Russia and the United States assurances back in the 1994 Budapest memorandum. How is the relationship with Russia and Ukraine and Europe and all going to play out? How is Poland going to, play a role? What happens to countries that are not in NATO, like Finland and Sweden, in terms of their security and their cooperation? What happens to Cyprus? I mean, there's another set of issues we haven't even looked at, where we thought we were moving forward on the framework for a resolution of the Cyprus conflict. We've got a coup in Turkey. We've got Britain, which still has sovereign basing rights. It's the old colonial power, in Cyprus, but no longer in the EU. Cyprus is not in NATO. I mean, I think we've got ourselves into an extraordinarily complex position, and we add on all the layers of populism, anti-establishment, kind of anti-institutional, and the US an anti-trade perspective. Brexit was weirdly not anti-trade in strange ways. The Remain campaign were about more trade within the EU context, and the EU campaign about more trade outside of the EU, which is quite different from the debate we have in the US. But it's still the same anti-globalization strains, with the EU. So, I mean, it's good luck in figuring that one out. So how does all this play out? What happens to TTIP and the Atlantic Trade Investment Partnership, TPP? Someone joked that I was from the UK was talking about that maybe Britain could join TPP, become, kind of, set up shop with Hong Kong and Japan, kind of as a sort of an offshore kind of floating zone for China investment. I was like, oh, this is a joke. This kind of complicates the position, even further. So I think, all of your guesses are as good as mine, or let's just say our informed, educated assessments are always as good as the next one in this. So I'm going a bit hoarse here.
No, we're at 4:15 right now, so I know you've had to.
Well, we had a last patient, observation
okay.
Kind of question here.
Okay.
So my background is Russian military intelligence.
Yeah.
In your opinion, how far is Russia politically willing to go in places like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, even Finland, because they've kind of seen startings of kind of hybrid warfare techniques starting in those areas. So in your opinion, how far is Russia politically willing to go into those spaces?
Well, this is a, kind of one of these, questions that requires, I think, quite a bit of perspective here, because, you were, Vladimir Hill was kind of pushing back on the whole, issue of Ukraine. Russia could easily have intervened in Ukraine on many different occasions and did not, going back to the early 1990s. So if you have a kind of a long-term perspective on this, between about 1992 and 1994, which was the backdrop to this Budapest memorandum, giving Ukraine, territorial assurances, which obviously weren't too much, from the UK, the United States, and Russia, there was a heck of a lot of pressure on Ukraine from Russia over Crimea. I mean, this was kind of, there was a huge debate and negotiation. It's no secret that Russia wanted Crimea, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union to, revert to Russia. And there were many elites, Putin was among them, if you look back to some of his statements when he was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, who really thought that there had been historical injustice that ought to be reversed. There was Lushkov, the mayor of Moscow. There were many members of the Russian Duma. Just Boris Yeltsin didn't seem particularly excised about the issue. But in the run-up to basically 1994, there was all kinds of tensions in Crimea. There were the killings of Crimean Tatar activists. There were all kinds of disappearances and political strife. And there were really dire warnings from Moscow, and particularly out of the Russian Duma, about the possibility of intervention, about the Black Sea Fleet if that wasn't resolved, about Ukraine still having a nuclear arsenal. That was the backdrop to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. Fast forward to 2008 and the war in Georgia. Similarly, dark warnings were made to the Ukrainians and the Georgians about what the Ukrainians could expect over NATO expansion. And the warnings were made quite clear that they would probably involve some kind of intervention in Crimea. It wasn't necessarily about eastern Ukraine, but there was always being kind of questions about the Donbass and Ukrainian populations spanning different borders. This has always been kind of a set of issues. The Ukrainian government under Yushchenko at the time pulled back from pushing the issue of NATO because it wasn't popular on a political level, and they extended the lease for the Black Sea Fleet. So then we start to think about what happened in 2013 and 2014 and the intervention. I mean, the Russians intervened in Georgia to teach the Georgians a lesson, after kind of a clash over powers in South Ossetia. That also had been, back to my thing about warned repeatedly from the Russians. And the warnings to Ukraine were crystal clear as well. I mean, at the elite level and, kind of at other levels as well. And so, basically the Russians, had warned for plenty of time that if they saw things going in a direction that they didn't like in Ukraine, there was an incredible amount of bribery and money handed over to Yanukovych and others, and messages sent very clearly that he shouldn't move too far towards the EU, which is kind of hedge his bets. He got completely caught between a rock and a hard place with the EU pushing on the association agreement, and kind of basically getting to commit and to going to make a decision, and Russia saying you'd better not do it, and him trying to kind of find a delicate way, he wasn't clever enough to do it, of basically having to not make a decision, for anybody. So basically we got into kind of a big blow, where everybody misread the situation, and where the Russians felt that, based on all of their warnings, that they had a necessity on their view to intervene. So what we're seeing with all of this military maneuvering is clear warnings that are being made to the Swedes, the Finns, the Balts, and everybody else. These are the kinds of nasty things that we could do, if we think it's necessary, if circumstances warrant it. So the Finns, for example, it was in the press, so I'm not revealing any kind of secret here. They've been contemplating joining NATO. This was even before Brexit. Suddenly there's a big flux of migrants on buses across the Finnish border, and some on bicycles and some in old cars. And it wasn't just, Russians or Syrians or, whatever. It's only migrants, picked up off the streets of Moscow. And the Finnish government got the message pretty quickly. The Finnish president, flies off to Moscow, and, all kinds of, discussions are had. And the migrants are no longer bussed across the border. So there's an awful lot of playing here, as you kind of, like you say, not just by military means, the exfiltration of the Estonian intelligence officer to show a message about what they could do. So, kind of what Putin and the Russians are basically saying is, we're making it very clear to you about what is acceptable and unacceptable to us. No more discussion about, NATO. We're wanting to remind the Baltic states that we still have, quite a lot of leverage. And every day you wake up, you remember that Moscow is here and Brussels is very far away. And NATO is, kind of really, okay, you've got your battalion, your naval forces, but, we see those naval forces in that battalion, and we can, kind of up that ante. So you've got to think, about, certain choices that you make. It's a kind of a very crude but very clear game that was incredibly transparent to the other side of the equation here who are playing it. And the message is being sent loud and clear, through the war in Georgia, and now the intervention that has become more overt than covert in Ukraine. So for anybody who wasn't clear about it, now it's clear. So my message on this is that, this is something that is going to be, kind of dealing with, and we have to be very careful and very clear about how we're going to manage it. And one way is signaling back, don't you dare, kind of take over that step. And others, we're going to have to come up, I think, with some very creative mechanisms of, sending messages and creating very clear frameworks. That's why I said we've got to go and think about what's our minimal acceptable and what is completely unacceptable to us on all kinds of different fronts. Because it's not just a military issue. It's cyber, which of course can come into that. It's political, it's economic, it's soft power and cultural. It's using language politics, it's using the disenfranchisement, perceived disenfranchisement, the anti-establishment, sentiment that peoples in different countries, joining force with Marine Le Pen, Marshal Le Pen, and other friends of kind of Russia and the Soviet Union, rekindling those old communist and old Comintern, contacts. It's all kinds of things because there's a perceived asymmetry on the part of Russia. If it was a big conventional clash with the United States and NATO is still about the United States, it wouldn't work out well for them, and it wouldn't work out well for us either because it would, immediately go nuclear again. Kind of one of the warnings that's being sent. But if you can, do everything under the radar, and the US isn't so good at that, because we're not playing the old imperial game, going back to those larger, historical perspectives. The Russians are playing a game that they've played, for a very long time, back in the 19th century. If you look back into that period, the Tsars were doing similar things. They acquired a lot of lands by, kind of making deals with, foreign potentates and, kind of giving people places of courts and nice policies and, kind of helping protect them from, the next person, down this, across the border who might come in and be encroaching on their territory. So it's again, we have to have a big picture, look at this and not just look at Ukraine and what's happening in Crimea, but look at, the totality of things that are happening. And clearly Syria is intended to be some leverage as well. Although, well, that's a kind of a mess for all of us.
I wish we
I've
could.
lost my voice now, actually. I think so.
Well, I think actually no, it's not. I'm not saying it's good that you lost your voice, but it's fitting. No. But I really wish we could go further, but I think it should just be obvious in the past hour and a half why Dr. Hill is one of the world's foremost experts on Russia, U.S.-Russia relations, Eurasia, transatlantic relations, just a whole host of topics. Thank you for just a fantastic conversation. This was great.
And I always really appreciate the pushback and things as well, because you can't learn yourself unless people challenge this. And I think that's what we all should be doing. We should be. That's really what you're trying to do with PS21, challenge assumptions and kind of revisit a lot of our ideas and frameworks for things. Yeah. So thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thanks.